They say that silence is golden. But sometimes, silence is a gathering storm, a quiet, immense pressure building just beyond the horizon, capable of sweeping everything away, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard truth and the wreckage of lies. In a sprawling Bel Air mansion where crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of expensive suits and designer gowns, there was no silence. There was only the sound of success, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, murmured congratulations, and the endless flash of cameras capturing the power couple of the hour, Ethan Hayes and Chloe Vance. Tonight was their coronation, the one-year anniversary of Phoenix Enterprises, the tech empire they had miraculously raised from the ashes. Ethan, with his perfectly tailored tuxedo and charismatic smile, stood on a small stage, his arm possessively around Chloe's waist. She was breathtaking in a shimmering silver dress, the picture of a grieving widow who had found strength and love anew. He spoke into the microphone, his voice smooth and confident, telling the story of tragedy and triumph, of how he and Chloe had honored the memory of their fallen founder, the brilliant Liam Vance, by building his legacy into something even greater. Liam, his best friend. Liam, Chloe's late husband, tragically lost in a fiery car crash exactly 1 year ago. The guests listened, captivated by the tale of resilience. But then, the grand oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open, not with a gust of wind, but with a deliberate, quiet push. A man stood silhouetted against the night. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. As he stepped forward, the murmuring of the crowd began to falter, one conversation dying after another, creating a ripple of silence that spread through the room like a stain. He wasn't smiling. A faint, silver scar traced a line from his temple to his eyebrow, the only mar on an otherwise impossibly familiar face. The champagne flute slipped from Chloe's fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the now deafening quiet. Ethan froze mid-sentence, his mouth agape, his confident facade crumbling into a mask of pure, primal fear. The man in the doorway was not a ghost, not a memory. He was Liam Vance, and in his eyes, there was no warmth of reunion, no joy of a miraculous return. There was only the cold, calm certainty of a judge who had arrived, at long last, to deliver his verdict. The storm had finally broken. Before the fire, before the fall from grace, before the silence of a man presumed dead, there was a time that felt like a sun-drenched photograph, eternally golden. To understand the depth of the reckoning, you must first understand the height of the love and the trust that was shattered. The story of Liam, Ethan, and Chloe was not born in a boardroom, but in a cluttered college dorm room, and later, a cramped suburban garage, smelling of stale coffee, cheap pizza, and the electric hum of impossible dreams taking flight. Liam Vance was the quiet heart of it all. He was not a man built for the spotlight. He was a man built to create the light itself. His genius was not loud or flamboyant. It was a deep, steady river of logic and innovation. While other students were chasing parties, Liam was chasing elegant solutions to complex coding problems, his fingers flying across a keyboard, building worlds out of pure data. He saw beauty in the clean architecture of an algorithm, poetry in a perfectly executed line of code. He came from a simple background, a family of mechanics and teachers who had taught him the value of hard work and the quiet dignity of building something with your own two hands. For Liam, his hands were his voice, and they spoke in a language of creation that few could understand, but many would soon admire. One of the few who did understand, or at least understood the power of what Liam could create, was Ethan Hayes. Ethan was Liam's opposite, a force of nature where Liam was a force of intellect. He was the sun to Liam's steady earth. Charismatic, handsome, and armed with a smile that could disarm the most skeptical investor, Ethan was a born salesman. He and Liam had met as freshman roommates, a random pairing that quickly forged a bond stronger than brotherhood. Ethan saw the quiet brilliance in Liam and became his champion, his defender, his bridge to the rest of the world. He would pull Liam out of his shell, translate his technical jargon into thrilling pitches, and stand beside him, deflecting any who would doubt or dismiss the quiet genius. Liam, in turn, saw in Ethan a loyalty and a drive that he deeply admired. He never saw Ethan as just a business partner. He saw him as the other half of his own ambition, the voice he wished he had. Theirs was a pact sealed over cheap beer and late-night study sessions, a promise that together they would build something that would last. And then there was Chloe. If Liam was the mind and Ethan was the voice, Chloe was the soul of their small universe. She entered their lives like a melody you can't get out of your head, a vibrant art student who saw past Liam's shyness and into the passionate world he held within. She was drawn to his depth, his unwavering focus, and the gentle kindness in his eyes. She celebrated his breakthroughs with as much enthusiasm as Ethan, but she also soothed his frustrations when an idea wouldn't take shape. She became their anchor, the one who reminded them to eat, to sleep, to look up from the computer screens and see the world they were trying to change. The three of them became inseparable, a perfect triangle of friendship, love, and ambition. They were a team, a family, an unstoppable force. Their company, Innovate Dynamics, started in the garage of the small house Liam and Chloe rented after graduation. It was their sanctuary and their laboratory. The days were a blur of creation, the nights a fever dream of possibility. Liam would spend 48 hours straight, fueled by nothing but caffeine and obsession, perfecting the code for their flagship software, a revolutionary platform he called Aura, designed to streamline creative workflows in a way no one had ever imagined. Ethan, meanwhile, would be on the road, wearing out his only good suit, sleeping in his car between meetings, relentlessly pitching their vision to anyone who would listen, turning every no into fuel for the next attempt. Chloe turned the garage into a home, painting the walls, bringing them meals, and using her artistic eye to design their first simple logo. She believed in Liam, and her belief was the foundation upon which he built everything. The day they secured their first round of major funding was a day etched in their collective memory. Ethan burst into the garage, waving a check, his face split by a triumphant grin. He lifted Liam off his feet in a bear hug, shouting that they had done it. Chloe cried tears of joy, and the three of them danced around the cluttered space like children, champagne spraying over old circuit boards and blueprints. That night, they sat on the roof of the little house, looking at the stars, feeling like they owned the sky. Liam turned to Chloe, a ring he had been saving for months in his pocket, and asked her to be his wife. Ethan, their witness and their biggest cheerleader, placed his hand on both their shoulders and made a toast, his voice thick with emotion, swearing that he would always protect what they had, that their bond was for life. It was a perfect moment, a snapshot of a future that seemed limitless and bright. Liam looked at his future wife and his best friend, the two pillars of his world, and felt a sense of gratitude, so profound it almost hurt. He had everything a man could ever want. He was safe, he was loved, and he was blind to the almost imperceptible shadows that had already begun to gather at the edges of their perfect, golden world. Success, when it finally arrives, is rarely the gentle dawn you imagine. It is often a blinding midday sun, one that warms you, but also casts long, dark shadows you never knew were there. As Innovate Dynamics exploded from a garage project into a multi-million-dollar corporation, the lives of Liam, Ethan, and Chloe were transformed. The small rental house was replaced by a sprawling architectural marvel in the hills, and the garage was traded for a sleek headquarters of glass and steel that scraped the Los Angeles sky. The hum of a few overworked computers was now the buzz of hundreds of employees, all working to build on Liam's vision. Yet, in this gleaming new world, the golden photograph of their past began to curl at the edges, the colors starting to fade. Liam, however, remained largely unchanged. He was still the quiet architect, more at home in the R&D labs than in the polished mahogany boardroom. He took the new wealth not as a personal victory, but as a greater resource, a bigger toolbox to build even more audacious dreams. He still wore simple jeans and t-shirts to the office, still ate lunch at his desk, and still found his purest joy in the silent hours after midnight, wrestling with a line of code until it bent to his will. The media adored him. Tech journals and business magazines splashed his face on their covers, calling him the digital Da Vinci, the quiet king of Silicon Beach. They wrote paragraphs praising his visionary mind, his elegant solutions, his quiet humility. And in every article, Ethan Hayes was mentioned as the charismatic CEO, the business prodigy who gave that vision a voice. But for Ethan, being the voice was no longer enough. He wanted to be the vision. The first cracks appeared not as a seismic event, but as a series of subtle hairline fractures in Ethan's demeanor. He began to linger a little too long on the press clippings, his smile tightening whenever a reporter directed a technical question to Liam instead of him. During company-wide meetings, he would present Liam's newest breakthrough, using the word "we" so fluidly that the lines of credit began to blur. "Liam and I were working late one night," he would say, "and we came up with a solution." In reality, Liam had been working for 3 sleepless weeks, while Ethan had been at a cocktail party, networking. Liam, ever trusting, saw this as Ethan being a good partner, a team player. He would even add to it, saying, "I couldn't have done it without Ethan's market insights," genuinely believing it. He didn't see the flicker of resentment in his friend's eyes, the slight clenching of a jaw. He didn't realize that every word of praise for him felt like a personal insult to the man standing in his shadow. While Ethan's envy festered in the fluorescent lights of the office, Chloe's discontent blossomed in the gilded cage of their new life. The woman who had once been thrilled by a celebratory pizza on the floor of a garage now found herself bored by catered dinners with billionaires. She had everything she had ever dreamed of, and it wasn't enough. She fell in love with the reflection of herself in the eyes of high society, the power she felt wearing a dress that cost more than a car, the intoxicating thrill of being known, of being admired. She began to see Liam's dedication not as a virtue, but as a flaw. His passion for work, which she had once found so attractive, now felt like neglect. He was the anchor that had secured their dream, but now she felt chained to him, an anchor holding her back from soaring in the social stratosphere she so desperately craved. Their arguments were quiet, civil, but laced with a growing poison. "There's a benefit for the art museum tonight, Liam," she'd say, standing in the doorway of his home office, draped in diamonds. "Everyone will be there." He would look up from his tablet, his eyes tired but kind. "I'm so close on this new encryption model, honey. Can we just skip this one? I'm not much for those crowds anyway." Her face would fall, not with anger, but with a profound, weary disappointment. "You're never much for anything anymore, Liam. Except this, except the work." He misunderstood her loneliness as a simple desire for things, attempting to patch the growing distance between them with gifts, a new car, a surprise trip to Paris she would take with a friend, a necklace with a price tag that could fund a startup. He was trying to solve an emotional problem with financial solutions, completely oblivious to the fact that he was only pushing her further away, making her feel more like a pampered possession than a cherished partner. And into this void stepped Ethan. He saw Chloe's frustration, her yearning, because it mirrored his own. Their alliance was forged in stolen moments and quiet complaints. It began at a company gala, celebrating a new product launch. Liam was, as usual, mobbed by his engineers, excitedly sketching an improvement on a cocktail napkin. Chloe stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching her husband, feeling like a beautiful, expensive ornament. Ethan appeared beside her, a glass of scotch in his hand. "He's in his own world, isn't he?" Ethan said, his voice a low murmur. "A brilliant world, but it leaves little room for anyone else." Chloe let out a sigh she didn't realize she'd been holding. "He doesn't see it," she whispered. "All of this. He thinks it's just a bigger garage." Ethan turned to her, his eyes holding a dangerous combination of sympathy and ambition. "But you see it," he said. "You're the one who deserves to be the queen of this castle, not just the brilliant man's wife." It was the first time someone had validated the selfish, ugly thoughts she had been having, and it felt intoxicating. They stood there for a long time, on that balcony overlooking the city lights, their conversation a litany of shared resentments, their silent complaints about the one man who had given them everything, weaving a dark, intimate thread between them. That night, as Liam finally came home, tired but happy, he paused by the bedroom door and watched Chloe pretend to be asleep. He felt a pang of guilt for his absence, resolving to try harder, to be better. He had no idea that in the quiet darkness, The two people he trusted most in the world had just taken their first, fateful step away from him, together. The thread of resentment that had woven itself between Ethan and Chloe soon became a rope, pulling them together in a conspiracy of two. Their shared dissatisfaction was no longer enough. It demanded action. The betrayal began not with a spreadsheet, but with a stolen kiss in the sterile silence of the executive parking garage long after the last employee had gone home. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of allegiance. It was a cold, silent pact, a final severing of their loyalty to Liam. In that moment, he was no longer a friend or a husband. He was an obstacle, the final gatekeeper to the life they felt they deserved. With that line crossed, every subsequent betrayal became not only possible, but logical. The plan to steal from him was born a few days later, whispered over an expensive dinner at a restaurant Liam would have found too pretentious. Ethan, ever the smooth strategist, laid it out. It wasn't stealing, he rationalized. It was a market correction, a reallocation of assets. He was the one closing the deals, shaking the hands, building the brand. Chloe was the one sacrificing her life, playing the part of the supportive wife to a man who was emotionally absent. Weren't they entitled to a larger share of the rewards? The mechanics of the deception were deceptively simple, built upon the bedrock of Liam's unwavering trust. Ethan, with his C-level access to the company's finances, was the architect. He began by establishing a network of shell corporations with bland, forgettable names like Apex Strategic Solutions and Viridian Consulting Group. They were registered in Delaware, then layered with offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, creating a labyrinth of transactions designed to frustrate any casual audit. The next step was to generate a stream of fraudulent invoices for services that were never rendered. Apex would bill Innovate Dynamics $200,000 for a market viability analysis. Viridian would charge $250,000 for proprietary software integration. The invoices were too device, professionally designed, filled with convincing jargon, and submitted through the proper channels. Chloe's role was far more insidious. She was the inside woman, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. She knew the rhythms of Liam's life better than anyone. She knew when he was on the cusp of a breakthrough, so deeply immersed in his work that the outside world, with its tedious paperwork, simply faded away. She would wait for those moments. She would walk into his study, a warm smile on her face, holding a small stack of documents. "Just a few things from accounting, honey," she would say, her voice a gentle interruption. Ethan said they're urgent. Tucked between legitimate contracts and routine expense reports would be an invoice from one of Ethan's ghost companies. As Liam reached for a pen, his mind still tracing lines of code, she would distract him, asking about dinner, mentioning a call from his mother, showing him a picture of a vacation spot. He would scrawl his signature without a second glance, his focus already returning to his work. Her hand never shook, her voice never wavered. With every forged signature, she was not just stealing money. She was methodically dismantling the man she had promised to love. The first transfer of funds was a heart-pounding success. The stolen money, clean and untraceable, landed in their offshore account. They had done it, and it was easy, too easy. Emboldened, their greed metastasized. 100,000 became 1,000,000, then 5, then 10. They grew careless, intoxicated by their own cleverness. They took a secret trip to Monaco, telling Liam that Chloe was visiting a spa in Arizona and Ethan was at a business conference in Chicago. They bought art, cars, and a secret apartment in the city where they conducted their affair and planned their next move. Their contempt for Liam grew in direct proportion to the amount they stole. He became a caricature in their minds, the nerdy, passionless drone whose genius they were simply harnessing for its proper purpose. They told themselves they were the true visionaries, the ones with the ambition to live the life their success demanded. But a ghost haunted their gilded cage, the constant gnawing fear of discovery. A casual question from an accountant, a random deep dive audit, or worse, Liam himself, finally looking up from his work and deciding to inspect the books. The realization dawned on them slowly, then all at once. As long as Liam Vance was alive, they were living on borrowed time. The money, the company, the life they had built, it could all be taken away. The thought was first given voice by Ethan on a rainy afternoon, in the sterile luxury of their secret apartment. He was staring out at the gray cityscape, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. "He's a safety net," Ethan said, his back to her, "but he's also a tripwire. One wrong step, and it all goes up in flames." Chloe, examining a new diamond bracelet on her wrist, didn't look up. "What are you saying, Ethan?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. He turned to face her, his eyes cold and clear. "I'm saying," he said, "that a legacy is much easier to manage than a living, breathing founder." And just like that, the unthinkable became a business plan. They didn't speak of it as murder. They used words like solution, permanent exit, and contingency. Liam had an upcoming solo trip planned, a drive up the scenic Pacific Coast Highway to speak at a major tech summit. It was a drive he made every year, a personal tradition. He always took his favorite car, a vintage 1967 convertible he had lovingly restored himself. The opportunity was perfect. The winding, treacherous cliffs of the coastline were notorious for accidents. Ethan, who had spent his teenage years working in his uncle's auto body shop, knew exactly what to do. It would be a small act of sabotage with devastating results. A carefully applied pressure to the brake fluid line, a tiny, almost invisible fissure that would hold for a while before bursting under the strain of a sharp turn. It would be a tragic, inexplicable, mechanical failure. A freak accident. Chloe's part was to play the loving wife to the very end. A week before his trip, she brought it up over dinner. "You should take the convertible, my love," she said, her voice full of warmth. "The drive will be beautiful. You deserve to relax, to feel the wind in your hair." The night before he was set to leave, while Liam slept soundly, exhausted from preparing his speech, Ethan slipped into the garage. The silence was broken only by the quiet, metallic click of his tools. He worked quickly, precisely, his hands steady. He was not a desperate man committing a crime of passion. He was a CEO executing a hostile takeover. As the sun rose the next morning, Liam kissed a smiling Chloe goodbye, oblivious. "I'll call you when I get there," he promised. "Be safe," she whispered, her eyes shining with what looked like love. She stood at the door and watched the classic car pull out of the long driveway and disappear down the hill. The trap was set. All she had to do now was wait for the phone to ring. The Pacific Coast Highway unfolded before Liam like a silver ribbon, flanked by the deep blue of the ocean on one side and the rugged, sun-baked cliffs on the other. For the first time in months, his mind was quiet. The complex architecture of code and the relentless pressure of board meetings dissolved into the roar of the V8 engine and the salty spray that misted his face. He was driving his prized possession, a 1967 convertible he had spent years restoring, a tangible piece of mechanical beauty in his digital world. The sun was warm on his skin, his favorite album was playing, and for a few blissful hours, he was not a CEO or a tech visionary. He was just a man, free, with an open road ahead of him. He thought of Chloe, of her warm smile that morning, her gentle insistence that he take this car, that he enjoy the journey. He felt a surge of love for her, for the life they had built. He was a lucky man. He was approaching a notoriously treacherous section of the highway, a series of sharp, hairpin turns carved into the cliffside. As he headed into the first curve, he gently tapped the brakes to bleed off some speed. The pedal felt soft, sinking a little too far before engaging. He frowned, making a mental note to check the fluid levels when he arrived. An old car, he thought, always something to tinker with. He entered the second turn, this one sharper and with a steeper decline. He pressed the brake pedal firmly. It slammed against the floorboard with no resistance, no pressure, nothing. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through him, a feeling of pure, unadulterated terror that his logical mind had never known. Every instinct, every calculation his brain could muster screamed a single, horrific truth. He had no brakes. The next few seconds were a chaotic symphony of physics and violence. He wrestled with the wheel, trying to use the friction of the cliff face to slow the accelerating car. The screech of tortured metal against rock filled the air. He saw the guardrail ahead, a flimsy-looking barrier of wood and steel that was his last hope. The car struck it, not slowing, but splintering it into 1,000 pieces. For a fraction of a second, there was a feeling of impossible silence, of weightlessness, as the car launched into the open air. Then, the world became a brutal, tumbling vortex of blue sky and brown earth. He felt the crushing impact as the car hit the side of the ravine, the shriek of twisting metal, the shattering of glass. His body was thrown against the door with bone-breaking force, and the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the door bursting open, ejecting him into the thorny brush as the mangled wreck of his car continued its deadly descent. He was found not by the wail of sirens, but by the quiet footsteps of a man named Samuel. Samuel was a man who had left the modern world behind decades ago, living a solitary life in a cabin tucked deep in the coastal hills. He was checking his snares when he saw the plume of black smoke rising from the ravine. Curiosity and a lifetime of self-reliance led him down the treacherous slope. He found the car first, an inferno of burning fuel and melted steel. Then, 50 yards away, he found Liam, a broken heap of a man, barely breathing, his life bleeding out onto the dry earth. Samuel saw the expensive watch, the well-made clothes, and knew this man did not belong here. His first instinct was to hike to the highway and flag someone down, but he distrusted the world he had left behind, its noise, its complications, its authorities. He looked at the unconscious man's face, saw not a rich man, but simply a man in need, and made a different choice. With a strength that belied his age, he carried Liam back to his hidden cabin. For weeks, Liam drifted in a fog of pain and fevered dreams. He was tended to by Samuel's wife, Mary, a retired nurse whose gentle hands cleaned his wounds and set his broken bones with practiced skill. When he finally woke, the world was a blur of confusion. He didn't know his own name. His past was a complete and utter blank, a black hole in his mind. He was a ghost long before he chose to be one, a man without an identity. His only reality, the four walls of the rustic cabin and the searing pain that was his constant companion. The memories returned in cruel, disjointed flashes, the image of a woman's smile, the feeling of typing on a keyboard, the complex structure of a line of code appearing in his mind's eye with no context. Each fragment was a tantalizing clue to a life he couldn't grasp, a torment that was worse than the physical agony. The truth arrived on a Tuesday, tucked under Samuel's arm in the form of a month-old newspaper he had picked up on a rare trip to a town miles away. As Mary changed his bandages, Liam's eyes fell upon the front page, used to wrap a loaf of bread. There was a picture of a car, his car, twisted and blackened. The headline read, "Tech billionaire Liam Vance perishes in fiery crash." And beneath it, another photo. It was from his memorial service. There was Chloe, his beautiful Chloe, her face a perfect mask of tragic grief, leaning heavily on the supportive arm of Ethan. His best friend, his brother, looking somberly into the cameras, his expression one of profound, dignified sorrow. In that single, heart-stopping instant, the black hole of his amnesia collapsed. Every memory, every moment of his life, came rushing back in a violent, crushing torrent. But the memories were now tainted, rewritten. Chloe's voice, urging him to take the convertible. Ethan's hand on his shoulder at their wedding, now feeling less like a gesture of friendship and more like a measurement for a coffin. The soft brake pedal, the failed signature requests, the secret glances. It all coalesced, transforming from a tragic accident into a breathtakingly clear, cold-blooded conspiracy. The pain of his shattered bones was nothing compared to the agony that ripped through his soul. The people he loved most in the world, the twin pillars of his existence, had tried to murder him. He stumbled to the small, cracked mirror in the corner of the room and stared at his reflection. The face that looked back was not his own. It was a gaunt, bruised stranger, with a new, angry scar marking his temple. Liam Vance, the trusting genius, the loving husband, the loyal friend, had indeed died in that ravine. In his place stood something else, something forged in fire and betrayal. He knew then that he could not go back. To reveal himself now would be suicide, They would call him a fraud, or worse, they would simply finish the job they had started. The world believed he was dead, and as he stared at the haunted face in the mirror, he realized his death was not a liability. It was an asset. It was the perfect disguise. It was the ultimate weapon. The old Liam was gone, burned away in the wreckage. What rose from those ashes was a ghost, a phantom with a singular, chilling purpose: to patiently watch the empire he built, and to wait for the perfect moment to reclaim it all, not by rebuilding, but by burning their world to the ground. The rustic cabin, once a haven for healing, transformed into a crucible. Liam's physical recovery was the first order of business, a brutal, deliberate climb out of the abyss. But before he could begin, he needed to secure his sanctuary. He sat with Samuel and Mary at their small wooden table, the warm light of a kerosene lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He looked at the two kind souls who had saved his life and told them a version of the truth. He didn't speak of a cheating wife or a traitorous best friend. The wound was too raw, the details too agonizing. Instead, he spoke of a corporate takeover, of powerful partners who wanted him erased so they could seize control of his life's work. He told them his death was their design, and that revealing himself now would be a death sentence. Samuel, a man who had seen the greed of the world and had willingly walked away from it, simply nodded, his weathered face set with determination. Mary placed her gentle hand on Liam's. "The dead can't be hunted," she said softly. "You'll be safe here. You are a ghost to the world now." Their simple, unwavering loyalty became the first stone in the new foundation of his life. With his secret safe, Liam began the arduous process of rebuilding his body. Every morning before dawn, he would force himself out into the cold mountain air, the pain in his healing leg and ribs a searing reminder of his purpose. The first few weeks, just walking to the edge of the woods, was a monumental struggle. But he pushed, turning agony into fuel. He started with limping walks, then grueling hikes, his muscles screaming in protest. He chopped wood for hours, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a meditation of controlled violence. The soft hands of a programmer became calloused and hard. The lean physique of an office worker became wiry and resilient. The physical pain was a welcome distraction, an anchor in the storm of his emotional trauma. He learned to welcome it, to master it. The old Liam had been a man of the mind. This new man, this ghost, would be a creature of unbreakable will, his body a vessel forged in pain and discipline. While his body hardened, his mind, his greatest asset, was being completely rewired. Samuel made discreet trips to towns and cities miles away, returning not with supplies, but with stacks of used books on forensic accounting, corporate law, stock market manipulation, behavioral psychology. In the quiet evenings, by the soft glow of the lamp, the tech genius who had once read academic papers on quantum computing now devoured texts on how to dissect a balance sheet, how to hide assets in offshore tax havens, how to exploit legal loopholes in a hostile takeover. He learned the language of his enemies, the predatory dialect of Wall Street and corporate law. His mind, accustomed to the elegant logic of code, absorbed this new information with terrifying speed, seeing the systems of finance and law as just another operating system, one that could be understood, exploited, and ultimately crashed. Simultaneously, he began to build his weapon. With Samuel's help, he acquired untraceable computer components purchased with cash in small, scattered electronics stores. In a corner of the cabin, a starkly modern command center began to take shape. He assembled a powerful, custom-built machine, completely offline, and used his expertise to create layers of security that would make it a digital fortress. Then, he reached into his past and retrieved the seed money for his war. A small fortune in cryptocurrency he had mined in the early days, stored on a hardware wallet he had kept for just such an emergency. It was his what-if fund, a hedge against a world he had never truly trusted, a decision that now seemed like a chilling premonition. With these tools, he began to craft his new identity. He couldn't be Liam Vance, so he would become someone else entirely. He chose the name Alexander Cole. It sounded old, established, vaguely aristocratic. Alexander Cole, as the legend would go, was a reclusive East Coast heir who had made a fortune in the dot-com boom and now managed his vast wealth through a series of blind trusts and anonymous brokers. He was a phantom in the financial world, a name whispered with a mix of awe and fear, known for his uncanny ability to predict market shifts and his aggressive, surgical investment strategies. Liam, the ghost in the machine, began to make Alexander Cole real. He created a digital footprint, a web of encrypted communications, and opened a series of offshore accounts. Then, as Alexander Cole, he began to invest. He made small, brilliant plays in the tech sector, using his insider knowledge not of specific companies, but of the technology itself. The cryptocurrency fund began to grow, and with it, the legend of Alexander Cole. From this remote outpost, his digital fortress nestled in the quiet woods, Liam began his surveillance. He became a silent observer of the life he had left behind. He was patient, methodical. He breached the low-level security of the city's public records, accessed satellite imagery, and set up alerts for any mention of Ethan Hayes, Chloe Vance, or Phoenix Enterprises. He watched as they graced the covers of magazines, their arms linked, their smiles practiced and perfect. He read articles where Ethan spoke of his vision for the company, a vision stolen wholesale from Liam's own notebooks. He saw Chloe's social media feed, a curated gallery of charity galas, European vacations, and extravagant purchases. He watched them live in his house, spend his money, and wear his legacy like a costume. And he felt nothing. The love, the hurt, the sense of betrayal, it had all been burned away, leaving behind only a cold, clear purpose. He was no longer a man watching his life being stolen. He was a predator, studying his prey, learning their patterns, their routines, their vanities, and their weaknesses. Every photograph, every interview, every financial report he secretly accessed was another piece of data, another stone for the weapon he was building. He was a ghost, and he was learning how to haunt. To the outside world, Ethan and Chloe Hayes were the living embodiment of a tragic fairy tale, remade into a triumph. They were the beautiful, resilient couple who had weathered the storm of unimaginable loss and emerged stronger, steering the company of their fallen friend to heights he had never known. They christened this new era with a name heavy with a symbolism only they could truly appreciate: Phoenix Enterprises. The name was a masterstroke of public relations. In every interview, Ethan would speak with practiced solemnity about rising from the ashes of Liam's tragic death, about honoring his legacy by ensuring his vision was reborn, twined, stronger, and more brilliant than before. They hosted galas that were the talk of the town. Their faces smiled from the covers of business magazines, and they donated vast sums of money to charities, polishing their image until it gleamed. Their mansion in the hills became a hub for the city's elite, a stage where they played the roles of gracious hosts and visionary leaders to perfection. From the outside, their life was not just golden, it was blinding. But inside the gilded cage, the reality was one of rust and rot. Ethan, the charismatic king, was in truth a paranoid and sleepless usurper. He lived in the shadow of the man he had erased, and the ghost of Liam Vance was a more demanding boss than the living man had ever been. He was obsessed with proving himself Liam's superior, driving the employees of Phoenix with a relentless, punishing fervor. He trusted no one. He would spend his nights, not celebrating his success, but locked in his state-of-the-art office, triple-checking financial reports, reviewing security camera footage, and jumping at shadows. A simple accounting question from a subordinate was treated as an interrogation. A friendly chat between two executives in a hallway was viewed as a potential conspiracy. His fear manifested as tyranny, his grip on the company tightening until the very culture began to suffocate. His relationship with Chloe was no different. He watched her constantly, his questions about her day less about affection and more about intelligence gathering. The love had long since curdled into a co-conspirator's vigilance. She was his greatest ally and his most dangerous liability. Chloe, for her part, had everything she had ever told herself she wanted, and she had never felt more empty. She had climbed to the pinnacle of society only to find the air thin and the view sterile. Her days became a meaningless, repetitive loop of hollow pursuits. She would spend thousands of dollars on clothes she would wear once, have long, meaningless lunches with women she despised, and sit on the boards of charities whose missions she couldn't remember. The thrill of the crime, the adrenaline of the shared secret with Ethan, had long since faded, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of anxiety. She wandered the cavernous, silent rooms of her mansion like a ghost herself, surrounded by priceless art and designer furniture that offered no comfort. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would find herself in Liam's old home office, which she had insisted on keeping exactly as he had left it. She would sit in his chair, running her hands over his old notebooks filled with equations and ideas she never understood. She wasn't mourning him. She was studying him, a relic from a past life, trying to understand how a man could be so brilliant, yet so blind. The guilt she felt was not for her betrayal of Liam, but a selfish, gnawing fear of the consequences of this beautiful, hollow world being snatched away. The lie that formed the foundation of their relationship was a poison that seeped into everything. The easy intimacy they had shared, as they plotted against Liam, was gone, replaced by a brittle tension and a deep, abiding mistrust. Their conversations became negotiations, their silences laden with suspicion. One evening, after a particularly successful product launch, they found themselves alone in the vast, white kitchen of their home. The air should have been celebratory, but it was thick with resentment. Chloe had discovered a private account Ethan had set up, a safety net he had created just for himself. "What is this, Ethan?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet as she slid a tablet with the bank statement across the marble island. He barely glanced at it. "It's a contingency fund," he said dismissively. "Smart business." "Smart for you," she countered, her eyes flashing. "Was this part of our plan? Or just yours?" The argument escalated quickly, the thin veneer of their partnership cracking open. "You need to trust me," he snarled. "Trust you?" She laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "The last man who trusted you drove off a cliff. I know exactly who you are." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "And I know who you are. You're the one who smiled and kissed him goodbye. Don't ever forget that we are chained together in this, Chloe. If I go down, you go down with me." They stared at each other, not as lovers or partners, but as two prisoners, each holding the key to the other's cell, both knowing that to use it would be to condemn themselves. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of a mountain cabin, Liam watched it all. He sat in the glow of a monitor, a live feed from a compromised smart speaker he'd had delivered to their mansion as a lavish, anonymous corporate gift. He had just witnessed their argument, his face illuminated by the flickering images of their rage. He felt no satisfaction, no anger, only a cold, clinical sense of confirmation. He saw their relationship for what it was, a fragile alliance of greed, now decaying under the pressure of their shared guilt and mutual suspicion. He had initially thought his plan would be to attack their company, their finances, their public image. But now he saw a much more elegant, more devastating path to justice. A gilded cage is strongest from the outside. From the inside, the bars are just bars. He realized he didn't need to break down the door. He just needed to give the prisoners the tools to tear their own world apart, piece by piece. He watched them on the screen, two miserable souls trapped in a paradise they had stolen, and he knew that their own rotting partnership would be his greatest weapon. The time for observation was over. The ghost in the woods had gathered enough data, analyzed every weakness, and mapped the fragile psyche of his enemies. It was time to move from defense to offense, to stop watching the cage and start rattling its bars. Liam, or rather, the calculating entity that was now Alexander Cole, understood that a direct assault would be clumsy. The key was not to break down their fortress, but to convince the occupants to burn it down themselves. His campaign began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a single, anonymous email sent from a heavily encrypted server, routed through a dozen different countries before it landed in the inbox of a hungry young financial blogger known for his aggressive, anti-establishment reporting. The email was short, precise, and contained a single, verifiable piece of information. a discrepancy in the quarterly growth numbers Phoenix Enterprises had reported to its shareholders, just a few percentage points off, but enough to suggest a deliberate inflation of their success. It was a small lie, a simple act of vanity on Ethan's part, but it was a lie Liam could prove. He attached a single heavily redacted document as proof and signed off simply as a friend of the truth. Then he leaned back and watched the first crack appear in their public facade. Next, he targeted their greed. Through a series of proxies and shell corporations, Alexander Cole's firm began making noise in the investment world about a revolutionary new biotech company on the verge of a breakthrough. The hype was carefully constructed, a masterpiece of digital marketing and fabricated buzz. Liam knew Ethan was arrogant, desperate to be seen as a visionary investor in his own right, not just the manager of Liam's legacy. As anticipated, the bait was taken. Ethan's personal investment broker, wooed by the seemingly impeccable credentials of Cole's intermediaries, brought the opportunity to him. Against the advice of his more cautious financial officers, Ethan poured millions of dollars of Phoenix's capital into the biotech firm, dreaming of the massive returns that would cement his reputation as a genius. A week later, after a staged, disappointing clinical trial, the biotech company's stock collapsed, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The company was a phantom, its assets gone. Ethan was left with a $7 million hole in his balance sheet and the impossible task of explaining his reckless gamble to a furious board of directors. While Ethan was reeling from his professional failure, Liam began the far more delicate and cruel work of dismantling their personal lives. He targeted Chloe first, using a weapon against which she had no defense: her own memories. The first gift arrived at the mansion by a boutique courier service. It was a small, plain box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a single, perfect, white gardenia. There was no card, no note. Chloe stared at it, the blood draining from her face. Gardenias were her favorite flower, a detail she had shared with very few people. Liam used to leave one on her pillow every year on the anniversary of their first date. She threw the flower away, her hands trembling, telling herself it was a coincidence. A week later, a second package arrived. It contained a rare, first-edition book of poetry she had once longed for, a book she had pointed out to Liam in a dusty old shop years before they were married. This was not a coincidence. This was a message. Someone was watching her, someone who knew her, someone who knew the secrets of her past with Liam. Consumed by a new kind of fear, she hid the book, not daring to tell Ethan. The gifts were not acts of love, they were instruments of terror, designed to isolate her in a prison of her own secrets. For Ethan, Liam's attack was digital, aimed directly at his paranoia. He knew Ethan's deepest fear was being played for a fool, of being betrayed just as he had betrayed. Liam hacked into their personal bank accounts, a laughably simple task, given that he had designed the original security protocols himself. He didn't steal anything. He simply created a ghost transaction, a digital forgery that showed a transfer of $50,000 from one of Chloe's accounts to an unknown offshore entity. It was a breadcrumb leading nowhere, a perfect piece of misdirection. Then, from another untraceable email address, he sent a message to Ethan's private account. The subject line was, "A warning." The body contained only a screenshot of the fabricated transaction and a single sentence. Who is she paying off? The seed was planted. Ethan, already suspicious and humiliated by his recent financial blunder, saw the email and his world tilted. He saw not a forgery, but proof of his darkest fears. Chloe was hiding money. She was plotting against him. The poison worked faster than Liam could have hoped. The already tense atmosphere in the mansion became openly hostile. Ethan confronted Chloe, not with a question, but with an accusation, throwing a printout of the faked transaction on the table. "Who are you paying? Are you planning to run?" he demanded. Chloe, blindsided and terrified by the anonymous gifts, saw his accusation as a sign of his own guilt, a smokescreen to cover his own secrets. "You're one to talk about secret accounts," she shot back, "after you gambled away $7 million playing the big shot investor." The argument was a hurricane of cruelty and paranoia, each of them using their intimate knowledge of the other to inflict the deepest wounds. He called her a greedy, untrustworthy snake. She called him an insecure fraud, living in a dead man's shadow. The foundation of their alliance, their shared crime, had now become their primary weapon against each other. They stopped speaking, communicating only through lawyers and assistants. They were no longer partners in crime. They were rivals in a cold war, each maneuvering to survive the inevitable collapse, each convinced the other was about to betray them. From his command center, Liam watched it all on his silent monitors, a detached and methodical god of their self-inflicted destruction. The seeds of doubt had taken root, and the harvest was going to be magnificent. The seeds of doubt, once sown, had taken root in the fertile ground of greed and paranoia. Now, it was time to unleash the storm that would wash the entire rotten structure away. Liam's campaign of psychological warfare had been the prelude. The main act would be an assault on the very foundations of their power, their money, and their credibility. From his mountain fortress, he assembled his magnum opus of betrayal. He compiled months of meticulously gathered data, the fraudulent invoices, the transaction records of the shell corporations, the timelines of the money transfers into a single, undeniable dossier. This was not the work of a rambling conspiracy theorist. It was a cold, hard map of a multi-million-dollar fraud. Then, as Alexander Cole, he used his considerable and growing resources to hire one of the most respected forensic accounting firms in the country, feeding them the information through an anonymous, encrypted channel. The firm, believing they had uncovered the scandal of the year, did exactly what Liam knew they would. They took the dossier directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The official letter from the IRS arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered by a courier to Ethan's top-floor office, a crisp white envelope that felt heavier than it should. Ethan slid it open, his eyes scanning the sterile, bureaucratic text. The words, forensic audit, criminal investigation, and federal offense seemed to leap off the page. The blood drained from his face. This was no longer about a nosy blogger or a market rumor. This was the United States government knocking at his door. The ghost that had haunted his sleepless nights had finally taken physical form, and it wore the badge of a federal agent. The terror was so profound, so absolute, that for a moment he couldn't breathe. As Ethan was grappling with the impending government investigation, Alexander Cole attacked on the second front. News feeds on every major financial network lit up with the same shocking headline. The notoriously reclusive and prescient investor Alexander Cole had just taken a massive short position against Phoenix Enterprises. In the cutthroat world of high finance, this was the equivalent of a public declaration of war. It was a billion-dollar bet that Phoenix was going to fail, and fail spectacularly. The market, which runs on confidence, reacted instantly and brutally. What does Cole know that we don't? The question echoed through trading floors from New York to Tokyo. The whispers Liam had started months ago now became a roar. The stock ticker for PHOENIX ENT, once a proud symbol of their success, became a waterfall of red. Panicked investors began to sell, a trickle that quickly became a flood. In less than 24 hours, the company's market value was slashed in half. The internal collapse was just as swift. The board of directors, a collection of ruthless individuals who valued profit above all else, turned on Ethan with the speed of sharks smelling blood. They called an emergency meeting. The boardroom, once the stage for Ethan's charismatic performances, became a courtroom where he was the sole defendant. They grilled him relentlessly. The disastrous biotech investment, the plunging stock price, the IRS investigation. His smooth answers and charming deflections were useless now. They saw not a leader, but a liability, a captain who was sinking their ship. His authority, the very thing he had killed for, was stripped from him in a humiliating vote of no confidence. He was placed on an indefinite leave of absence, locked out of the company he had stolen, a king deposed in a single afternoon. With their empire crumbling around them, the final, ugly act of self-preservation began. Ethan, desperate and cornered, made his move. He hired a shady cybersecurity contractor with the goal of rewriting history. His plan was to digitally frame Chloe, to manipulate server logs and forge digital signatures, to make it appear as though she were the mastermind behind the entire fraud, the grief-stricken widow who, in her vulnerable state, had been manipulated by outside forces, or better yet, had been the secret architect all along. He would paint himself as the trusting partner, too blinded by his loyalty to Liam's memory to see the deception happening right under his nose. He would sacrifice her to save himself, a final, fitting act of betrayal. But Chloe was no longer the naive, trusting woman she had once been. She had lived with a master manipulator for too long not to recognize the signs. She had hired her own private investigator weeks ago, and she was well aware that Ethan was preparing to throw her to the wolves, so she had prepared her own countermove. She met her high-powered attorney in a discreet hotel suite, her face pale but her eyes hard as steel. She placed a small digital recorder on the table and pressed play. It was a recording of a vicious argument she had provoked with Ethan just a week prior. His voice, clear and enraged, filled the room. "You think you can walk away from this? You were there. You smiled and waved as he drove off in that car. We are in this together, forever." The mention of the car, the implicit acknowledgement of their conspiracy, it was everything. The lawyer listened, his expression grim. It was a powerful bargaining chip, perhaps enough to trade for immunity, to paint herself as a terrified, coerced victim of a murderous sociopath. The lovers who had once plotted together in secret were now sharpening their knives, ready to slit each other's throats in the bright glare of the public spotlight. Their house of cards, built on a foundation of lies and sealed with blood, was finally, irrevocably, collapsing in on itself. In the smoldering wreckage of their empire, with the sirens of federal investigators growing louder each day, Ethan and Chloe found themselves in a place beyond hatred or mistrust. The cold, stark reality of mutually assured destruction. Their individual plots to betray one another had been thwarted by the simple, terrifying fact that each held the power to utterly ruin the other. A high-priced crisis management consultant, hired in a last-ditch effort, laid out their grim options in a sterile boardroom. They could either tear each other apart on the witness stand and both end up in prison for decades, or they could make one final, desperate stand together. Faced with the abyss, they chose the performance. A truce was declared, not with a handshake, but with the silent, resentful acknowledgement of two cornered animals who needed to cooperate to have any chance of escaping the trap. From this fragile, toxic alliance, a truly audacious and foolish plan was born. They would not hide. They would not retreat. They would throw the most lavish, defiant, and talked about charity gala the city had seen in years. It was a move of pure, theatrical arrogance, a final spin of the public relations wheel. They would call it the Phoenix Anniversary Gala, a celebration of their resilience, a testament to their strength in the face of what they would frame as a baseless attack by jealous competitors. Their goal was to create an illusion of stability so powerful, so dazzling, that it would momentarily blind their remaining allies, investors, and the media. They would project an image of a united, unbreakable couple at the helm of an unshakable company. It was a house of cards they intended to build in the middle of a hurricane, a grand gesture of denial against the encroaching tide of reality. The invitations were a work of art, thick, cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering sent to the most powerful and influential people in the country. And miles away, in his quiet cabin, Liam had anticipated this move perfectly. He knew their playbook, he knew their vanity. He knew they would choose spectacle over substance. The gala was not a complication to his plan. It was its destination. It was the stage he would have built for himself if they hadn't so graciously built it for him. One of the invitations, of course, was couriered to the New York office of the mysterious Alexander Cole. Ethan and Chloe debated the inclusion for hours. Cole was the man who had initiated the devastating short sell, their most public and powerful enemy. But to not invite him would be a sign of weakness, of fear. To invite him, and to potentially win him over, would be the ultimate coup. They sent the invitation, holding their breath. A day later, a crisp, formal reply came from Cole's assistant. "Mr. Cole, the email stated, was intrigued by Phoenix's unconventional tenacity and, in a rare break from his reclusive nature, would be honored to attend. The news sent a jolt of terror and exhilaration through Ethan and Chloe. The main event had its guest of honor. The weeks leading up to the gala were a masterclass in public deception. Ethan and Chloe were seen together everywhere, holding hands, smiling into the cameras, the perfect picture of a unified power couple. Chloe spent a fortune on a breathtaking, custom-made gown of deep crimson, a color that would ensure she was the center of all attention. Ethan, meanwhile, worked with a team of speechwriters, crafting a narrative of victimhood and defiance. He practiced it for hours in front of his office mirror, perfecting every pause, every gesture of resolve, his voice ringing with a conviction he did not feel. They were actors preparing for the roles of their lives, their private Cold War carefully concealed behind a mask of solidarity. While they were preparing their costumes and their lies, Liam was preparing for his resurrection. His preparations were quieter, more profound. Samuel, using a discreet tailor in a distant city, had procured for him a perfectly fitted dark gray suit. When Liam put it on, he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger he was finally coming to know. The boyish tech genius was gone, replaced by a man with haunted, determined eyes and a faint scar that served as a permanent testament to his journey. His transformation was complete. He was not just an architect of code anymore. He was an architect of justice. On his computer, he put the final touches on his own presentation. A devastatingly simple video file. It was a timeline, intercutting cold, hard financial data with secret audio recordings of their plotting, news clippings of their lies, and ending with a single, clear image of a tampered brake line. It was the entire story of their betrayal, condensed into a 5-minute-long execution. The night of the gala arrived, a warm, clear evening in Los Angeles. The grounds of their mansion were aglow with thousands of tiny lights, the air filled with the sounds of a string quartet and the murmur of arriving guests. Ethan and Chloe stood at the top of the grand staircase, ready to make their entrance. He adjusted his bow tie. She smoothed down her crimson dress. They looked at each other, and for a moment, the performance fell away, revealing the raw, shared terror in their eyes. They were on the edge of the precipice, about to take their final, desperate leap. At that same moment, a sleek, black, anonymous car was making its way through the winding canyon roads, heading toward the distant glow of the party. Inside, Liam Vance sat in the back, his face calm, his hands resting in his lap. He was no longer a ghost hiding in the mountains or a phantom pulling strings from the shadows. He was a man returning to the scene of the crime, the chief mourner at a funeral no one knew was happening. The invitation he held was not the one they had sent. It was an invitation to judgment, and it was finally time for him to deliver it. The grand ballroom of the Vance mansion was a masterpiece of orchestrated denial. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest and most powerful figures mingled under the soft glow of chandeliers, their laughter and conversation a testament to Ethan and Chloe's desperate gamble. It was working. The sheer audacity of the event, the confident smiles on the hosts' faces, the river of vintage champagne, it all created a powerful narrative of stability. Ethan took the stage, bathed in a warm spotlight, looking every inch the triumphant leader. He began his speech, his voice resonating with carefully crafted sincerity. He spoke of legacy, of honoring the memory of his dearly departed friend, Liam Vance. He spoke of resilience, of the strength it took to guide Phoenix Enterprises through the darkness of tragedy. They tried to tear us down with lies and rumors, he said, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. But they underestimated our resolve. They underestimated the strength of the foundation Liam built, a foundation we are proud to build upon. The crowd applauded, captivated by the performance. And then, the great oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A collective, curious glance rippled through the room, which quickly turned into a wave of stunned silence. The man who stood there was Liam Vance. He was not a ghost, not a specter, but a solid, breathing presence. He was thinner, harder, and the scar on his temple was a stark, pale line against his skin, but it was undeniably him. A waiter dropped a tray of glasses, the sound of them shattering on the marble floor echoing the shattering of reality in the room. On the stage, Ethan's words died in his throat, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and pure, animal terror. Beside him, Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as if to hold back a scream. The electric hush that fell over the ballroom was more profound than any sound. Liam did not speak. He did not need to. His very existence was an accusation. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, the crowd parting before him as if he were a biblical figure commanding the sea. His eyes were fixed on the two people on the stage, the two people who had been the twin sons of his universe, his wife and his brother. He felt the weight of hundreds of stares, the frantic whispers that were beginning to erupt like wildfire. He reached the foot of the stage and stopped, looking up at them. He saw their panic, their world imploding behind their eyes. There was no confrontation, no shouted accusation. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to a man standing near the audio-visual controls, a man with the weathered, kind face of Samuel, looking entirely out of place in a borrowed suit, but standing firm with a resolute sense of duty. Samuel pressed a button. Instantly, the massive screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the gleaming Phoenix Enterprises logo, flickered to black. Then, a new image appeared. A photograph of Ethan and Chloe, locked in a passionate embrace on the balcony of a hotel in Monaco. The date stamp on the photo was from a week before Liam's accident. A collective gasp swept through the audience. The scandal was social, juicy, and shocking. Then the images changed, shifting to a flowchart of corporate entities, Apex Strategic Solutions, Viridian Consulting Group, and a dizzying display of bank transfers, wire receipts, and forged signatures. The social scandal had become a massive financial crime. The investors in the room stared at the screen, then at Ethan, their expressions hardening from shock to cold fury. But Liam was not finished. The final slide was a black screen with a single audio waveform pulsing in the center. And then, a voice filled the room, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system. It was Ethan's voice, from a secret recording Liam had recovered. "It has to be the car," Ethan's voice whispered, a venomous, conspiratorial hiss. "The cliffs on that stretch of highway. A simple mechanical failure is untraceable. Tragic, but clean." Then came Chloe's voice, soft and steady. "He has to take the convertible. I'll make sure of it. He trusts me." The room went dead silent again, but this was a different silence. It was the silence of absolute horror. The whispers of an affair and the complexities of fraud were one thing. This was the cold, clear sound of a murder plot. Chaos erupted. People scrambled backwards away from the stage, away from Ethan and Chloe, as if they were radioactive. The flashing strobes of press cameras, from the reporters who had been invited to cover a party, now became a merciless, blinding barrage, documenting a public execution. Chloe, her face as white as a sheet, finally broke. A long, guttural scream tore from her throat as her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the stage in a heap of crimson fabric. Ethan stood frozen for a moment longer, his charismatic mask completely gone, revealing the weak, terrified man beneath. He looked out at the sea of horrified, accusing faces, and then he looked at Liam, who had not moved, had not flinched. At that moment, as if on cue, the ballroom's main doors opened again. This time, it was not one man, but a dozen, all wearing the dark blue uniforms and grim expressions of the Los Angeles Police Department. They moved through the panicked crowd with professional calm, their presence prearranged, the final, inescapable piece of Liam's meticulous plan. They ascended the stage, stepping around the sobbing form of Chloe, and approached the catatonic Ethan. The cold metallic click of handcuffs being fastened around his wrists echoed through the ballroom, a sound of finality. As they led him away, his eyes met Liam's one last time. In them, Liam saw not hatred, but a pathetic, pleading confusion. He had been so thoroughly outplayed, he couldn't even comprehend the game. Liam stood there, a solitary, silent figure in the eye of the hurricane he had created. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel joy. He only felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a debt being paid in full. The reckoning was complete. The storm had passed, and in its devastating wake, there was only the truth. The aftermath of the Phoenix Anniversary Gala was not just a scandal, it was a detonation that sent shockwaves through the entire city. The media frenzy was insatiable. News channels ran the footage of Liam's return and the subsequent arrests on a continuous loop. Headlines screamed from every newspaper and website. The ghost of Silicon Beach, love, lies, and attempted murder. Phoenix Enterprises crumbles to ash. The company, built on a stolen dream and a murderous lie, collapsed within a week. Its stock became worthless, its assets were frozen, and its board members scrambled to distance themselves from the toxic legacy of Ethan and Chloe Hayes. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Faced with irrefutable evidence, the audio recordings, the financial trail, the public testimony of their own downfall, they turned on each other with a final, desperate ferocity, each painting the other as the manipulative mastermind. But it was no use. Their guilt was a shared, indivisible thing. They were both found guilty on all counts, their sentences ensuring they would spend the rest of their lives behind the cold, hard bars of a maximum security prison. A few weeks later, Liam sat in the quiet, unassuming office of his new lawyer. He was no longer a ghost or a vengeful specter, but simply a man trying to untangle the wreckage of his former life. The lawyer, a meticulous gray-haired man named Davies, pushed a final folder across the desk. "Everything is settled," Davies said. "The company's assets have been liquidated. A significant portion has been set aside in the trust fund you requested for the Samuel and Mary Peterson." He paused, then looked at Liam with a strange expression. "There is one last thing. It's unusual." During the SEC's investigation into Ethan's finances, they unraveled a rather terrifying connection. He explained that in his reckless expansion, Ethan had taken on a silent partner, a lending firm that provided a huge infusion of cash. This firm, it turned out, was a front for a notoriously violent criminal syndicate. The money they had invested was dirty, and they expected it back with an exorbitant return. Davies continued. "The money Ethan and Chloe embezzled from you, the majority of it was the syndicate's. Liam, you had discovered this connection just before your accident. The investigators believe you were trying to find a way to pay them off and cleanly sever ties." A slow, chilling understanding dawned on Liam. He had been trying to escape a trap he never knew he was in. Davies leaned forward. "By stealing that specific money and taking you out of the picture, Ethan and Chloe didn't just take your fortune, they took your place. They inherited your debt to some of the most dangerous men on the West Coast." The final, perfect, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Liam had planned a meticulous revenge, but fate had authored a postscript far more terrible and poetic than he could have ever conceived. Ethan and Chloe were in prison, but their true sentence was not to the state. Their true sentence was to the syndicate who had lost millions and who had famously long memories. Their lives, even in prison, were now worthless. They would spend every remaining day looking over their shoulders, living in a terror far more profound than any steel bars could provide. The justice Liam had sought was finite. The karma they had created for themselves was eternal. Liam did not reclaim his old life. He couldn't. That world, and the man who had lived in it, felt like a story about someone else. He sold the grand mansion, its beautiful rooms now just a hollow monument to a life of lies. He kept nothing but a few personal effects and the classic car he had once loved, now painstakingly restored by a master craftsman. He paid one last visit to the small cabin in the mountains. He didn't just thank Samuel and Mary. He gave them the deed to a vast plot of land and a trust that would ensure their quiet, noble life would remain undisturbed forever. They were the only two people in the world who had shown him selfless kindness, and he repaid it 1,000-fold. Then he simply disappeared. Some say he moved to a small coastal town in the Pacific Northwest, working as a mechanic and living a quiet, anonymous life. Others say he travels the world, forever a ghost, a man with no name and no past. The truth is, it doesn't matter where he went. What matters is the lesson he left behind, a lesson written in the ashes of a fallen empire and the ruin of two broken lives. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For in their quiet, they are not idle. They are observing, they are learning, and they are sharpening the truth into a weapon. And when they finally choose to break that silence, their voice will not be a plea for mercy, but the sound of a final, inescapable judgment. Công lý có nhiều hình dạng, và đôi khi nó được thực thi không phải bởi tòa án, mà bởi chính bàn tay của số phận. Hẹn gặp lại quý vị trong câu chuyện tiếp theo của Chuyện gia đình US.